My son's teacher called him a liar when he said his dad works at NASA. What happened at parents' night left her speechless. Even though it's been several days, I'm still trying to process it. My son, Noah, is in the fourth grade at Maple Ridge Elementary in Boulder, Colorado. Ever since he could talk, he's been fascinated by space. As a toddler, he would wrap himself in a blanket, grab a flashlight, and sit out on our porch, peppering me with questions about the stars, the moon, and what it would feel like to walk on Mars. When he learned about NASA, his curiosity exploded. He started talking about missions, satellites, and rovers with a wonder that reminded me daily how lucky I am to be his dad. For some context, I've worked at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory for nearly 15 years. I'm part of the propulsion engineering team, focusing on systems for deep space robotic missions. It's not glamorous to most people. We don't wear astronaut suits, but it's challenging, meaningful, and deeply rewarding. What we build goes to places no human has ever been, and Noah has always taken immense pride in that. He tells everyone, his friends, his teachers, anyone who will listen. So when he came home one day last month quiet and withdrawn, my wife and I immediately knew something was wrong. At dinner, when we asked him about school, he barely shrugged, a red flag right there. With a little gentle prodding, he finally mumbled, "Mrs. Whitaker said I was making stuff up." I looked up. "Making what up?" He pushed his peas around his plate and said, barely audible, "That you work at NASA." My wife and I exchanged a look. I felt a twist in my stomach. What exactly did she say? "We were talking about our parents' jobs for career day," he explained. "I said you work on rockets at NASA." She said that wasn't true and I shouldn't lie to get attention. I took a breath, tried to stay calm. "Did she say that in front of the class?" He nodded. "She said NASA people don't live here, that they're all in Florida or Houston." I felt heat rising in my chest, but I didn't want to overreact in front of him. I told him that she probably just didn't know about JPL and that she definitely should have handled it differently. I promised we'd talk to her. The next morning, I emailed Mrs. Whitaker and requested a meeting during parents' night. Her response was polite but dismissive, saying she'd be happy to clear up any misunderstandings from career day. My wife immediately said, "I'm coming with you. No way am I missing this." That evening, we tried to stay calm, but we were both deeply upset. It wasn't just what had been said, it was how Noah had shut down afterward. No fourth grader deserves to be humiliated for telling the truth. Her classroom was decorated with a half-hearted space theme. A few planets hanging from the ceiling, solar system posters on the wall. Under the circumstances, it felt ironic. Mrs. Whitaker, in her mid-50s with a crisp blouse and glasses on a chain, greeted us with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks for coming," she said, motioning to the small chairs in front of her desk. "I understand there was some confusion about career day." "Actually," I began carefully, "there seems to have been a misunderstanding on your end. Our son told you I work for NASA, and that is completely true." Her smile tightened. "I've been teaching for nearly 30 years," she said. "Children often exaggerate, especially when it comes to exciting things. I believe in encouraging honesty." I nodded slowly, then reached in my jacket pocket. "I agree." And in this case, he was being completely honest. I handed her my JPL badge. It clearly showed my photo, the NASA logo, and my position. She examined it with a puzzled expression. "JPL? That's part of NASA? I thought NASA was only in Florida and Houston." "NASA has centers across the country," I explained. "JPL is in Pasadena, California, managed by Caltech. We handle robotic missions, rovers, orbiters, deep space exploration." She stared at the badge again, clearly thrown off. "I wasn't aware," she said. "But surely you understand why it might have sounded unbelievable." My wife, quiet until now, spoke up, her voice steady. "What seems unbelievable is calling a child a liar in front of his classmates without taking 30 seconds to fact-check." Mrs. Whitaker flushed. "I wouldn't say I called him a liar." I leaned forward slightly. "You told him not to lie for attention, in a room full of other kids. That leaves little room for interpretation." She looked down, visibly uncomfortable. After a pause, she said, "You're right. I should have handled it differently. I apologize." We're not the ones who need the apology, my wife said. Our son does. Mrs. Whitaker nodded. Of course. I'll speak to him tomorrow. A private apology won't suffice, I said, calmly but firmly. You embarrassed him publicly. The correction should also be public. She sat there in silence for a moment, hands folded tightly in her lap. The color drained from her face. Then she slowly nodded. You're right, she whispered. I made a mistake. I'll make it right. We discussed how she could approach it. I offered a solution, not soft but fair. An apology to the class, with Noah beside her. A teaching moment, not a confession. She hesitated, but eventually nodded. Okay, I'll do it, and I'll mean it. Just as we were wrapping up, an idea sparked. I asked, would you be open to me giving a real career day presentation? I could bring materials from JPL, a model, some video clips. The kids might like hearing from someone actually working in space exploration. Her demeanor shifted immediately. Her eyes lit up, maybe with relief or hope. That would be incredible. I think the students would love that. 2 weeks later, I stood in front of 25 curious fourth graders. Noah sitting front row like he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. I brought a NASA-cleared scale model of the Perseverance rover, handouts about Mars, and high-def mission footage. The room was electric. Hands flew up after every sentence. They asked about Martian dust storms, rover control systems, the possibility of life, rocket fuel, aliens, and how big the universe really is. But what tightened my throat wasn't the science. It was Noah's face, beaming radiant. His eyes followed my every word like I was narrating the stars themselves. That pride, that spark, it didn't just survive the dismissal. It flourished. Mrs. Whitaker sat in the back, hands folded, fully engaged. She took notes, asked thoughtful questions. I saw real curiosity and maybe even a shift in her perspective. After class ended and the kids swarmed me, she waited until the last student left. Then she approached me quietly. Thank you, she said. This was extraordinary. I made a serious mistake. And I've learned, not just about NASA, but about listening before judging. Your son taught me that. So did you. Since that day, something changed in Noah. He became more confident, more expressive. He started writing himself notes, mission goals, invention ideas. Last night, he told me he wants to work at JPL someday, maybe lead a mission to Europa. He said it with a grin, like it was already on the calendar. Whether or not that dream comes true isn't the point. What matters is that he knows it's possible, that his voice matters, that standing up for the truth, even when it's hard, is something to be proud of. To Mrs. Whitaker's credit, she didn't stop there. She organized a full unit on space exploration for next month and asked me to help review the materials. She scheduled a virtual Q&A with one of our planetary scientists. She even mentioned she's considering a summer STEM education course. I believe her. People can change. But the moment that sealed came a few days ago. I was late picking Noah up. When I arrived, the classroom was empty except for him and Mrs. Whitaker. They didn't see me right away. They were looking at a solar system map, and Noah was animatedly explaining Jupiter's moons. She leaned in and said, "You're going to do amazing things one day. You know that." He looked up at her, voice steady. "You're teaching me now." That's when she noticed me. Our eyes met. We shared a silent nod. Some moments don't need fanfare. They just need truth. We left the school in the soft dusk light. Noah ran ahead of me, arms stretched like airplane wings. "Dad," he shouted, "I picked my science fair project. It's about Europa." I laughed. "Better get started then. Mission command." He grinned. "I'm going to need help designing the lander. Then we'd better make it strong enough to handle ice," I said as we walked to the car. And in that moment, the world felt impossibly wide and filled with wonder. I come to that school angry, ready for confrontation. But what I found instead was a bridge. And sometimes building bridges is just as important as building rockets. And seeing 25 fourth graders excited about space. That's a mission I'll never stop being proud of.